Hi guys, welcome to our next set of discussions. Um, we've been considering for the last several lectures how aspects of protein structure lead to this really important fundamental process in protein or in biochemistry, um, which is this idea of molecular recognition and specifically binding, right? Um, so we've considered some of the energetic aspects of that. We use hemoglobin as a model to dig into that into some detail, to see how structural elements of a protein lead to this idea of thermodynamic linkage and under the structural energetic underpinnings of cooperativity, which is going to be super important for all kinds of things that we'll also be talking about as we go along. And so that brings us to, in my little cascade of protein function, from binding, which we can say we sort of now talked about at a basic level, to this next layer up of protein function, which is, of course, catalysis, right? Okay, so to set the stage, if you think back to that reaction I sort of started the course with, right? Remember this one? Started out with glucose plus inorganic phosphate goes to glucose 6-phosphate, right? And you remember I pointed out that the free energy change for this reaction is in the range of plus 14 kilojoules per mole, right? All right. And it's an essential reaction. I said it's got to go, and yet it's got this unfavorable free energy. And of course, we solved that, if you recall, by coupling it to a favorable reaction, which is the hydrolysis of ATP to ADP and inorganic phosphate, which has a standard state free energy change in the range of minus 31 kilojoules per mole, right? So that this overall process can now, of course, be made to go glucose plus ATP gives glucose 6-phosphate plus ADP, right? With a overall favorable standard state free energy of about minus 17 kilojoules per mole, right? Okay, that's great. Except for one problem. Take glucose, take ATP, mix them into a test tube, nothing happens, right? Even though that overall system now has a quite favorable free energy change, minus 17 kilojoules per mole, just mixing ATP with glucose will never synthesize on any time scale you would care to think about single molecule of glucose 6-phosphate, right? Here's another example. Consider this process where we have a molecule, hopefully you're going to recognize, right? Which is something that looks like this. It's an amide bond, right? We've been talking about proteins, so you recognize that. But it turns out, if you reverse that synthetic process we talked about, which was this dehydration reaction, where that nitrogen essentially nucleophilically attacks that carbonyl carbon, you can reverse that process in a hydration reaction to cleave that polypeptide back into its constituent parts. Right? Turns out the free energy for this process, on average, is in the range of minus 10 kilojoules per mole, which means amide bonds are not thermodynamically stable. The free energy balance for an amide bond spontaneously is hydrolyzed, right? Constituent amino acids, polypeptides, which means all the proteins that make up everything on the planet, right, are not thermodynamically stable. But here we sit, All right. So why? Well, the reason is that the time constant at pH 7, I haven't explained time constants yet, but I will soon, for this reaction is in the range of 10 to 1,000 years, depends a little bit on the amino acids themselves, right? So on a time scale typically relevant for life, that ain't gonna happen, right? But what happens if you have a damaged protein? What happens if you make a mistake when you're synthesizing a protein at the ribosome, right? What happens when you need to regulate the activity of a particular protein by getting rid of it, which happens all the time? So there has to be some way then for cells, for basic biochemistry, to regulate the progression of these events in the face of this thermodynamic balance, making things happen in certain ways, or speeding them up or slowing them down. And of course, as you guys all remember, any substance, all right, that speeds up or accelerates a given process, and in our case, that process is going to be a chemical process, but is it not itself modified, is of course known as a catalyst, right? And in biology or in biochemistry, the vast majority of the catalysts that we are going to worry about, think about, of course, are enzymes, right? Now, most enzymes that you're going to encounter are proteins, right? I'd say the vast majority are proteins, but not all, right? You guys may have heard of this. If you haven't, if you have, think about it for a second. If you haven't, there are some significant classes of really important biological catalysts where the actual chemistry is carried out by RNA, right? In most of those cases, there's also proteins involved in sort of sculpting or structuring this RNA. But in some cases, the actual chemistry is done by the bases themselves in a piece of RNA that's folded in a particular way. The ribosome is a great example of this, right? Okay, so back to the examples I just gave you, of course, the enzyme that carries out this process of taking glucose and ATP and turning it into glucose 6-phosphate is an enzyme known as hexokinase, or it has a cousin known as glucokinase. And of course, this process of clipping amide bonds, hydrolyzing amide bonds, is carried out by one of a large family of enzymes known as proteases. And we met one of these when we talked about that alpha-lytic protease that David Baker and David Agard studied, right? Okay, now enzymes in general are just stunningly good catalysts, right? Far, far better than the best catalysts that human beings have been able to create from first principles, right? We're just really not terribly good at this compared to what evolution has pulled off, right? So enzymes typically can work in an incredibly broad temperature range, right? Anywhere from 0 degrees up to 100 degrees Celsius, you can find protein catalysts. Another amazing thing about enzymes is they can show, essentially, depending on the enzyme, they can show near perfect or perfect stereospecificity. And this is one of the places where humans, engineers, chemical engineers trying to design catalysts, where we really struggle a lot. Getting chemical reactions that have stereo centers to only react a certain way, right? It's really common for the catalysts we make to result in enantiomeric mixtures. But enzymes can be perfect, right? They can basically never miss, depending on the enzyme. They can also show incredible rate enhancements. Rate enhancements for enzymes can vary anywhere from 10 to the 4th up to 10 to the 14th, right? In terms of their ability to accelerate a reaction beyond the rate that it would spontaneously go, right? And what we're going to find, as I mentioned when we started all of this talking about binding, is that all of this, right, when in a lot of ways, you get down to it, is going to turn into, or is going to turn on this idea of basically converting aspects of something, what we just studied, which is ligand binding, turning aspects of simple binding and figuring out ways to exploit the ability of enzymes to recognize particular characteristics of molecules and bind them in particular or particularly tight ways and turn that into massive chemical catalysis, right? That's the secret behind the big picture behind how enzymes are going to work, right? But to understand this, right, we got, again, like we did with binding, we've got to build sort of a quantitative framework where you really can't get your head around how these things work, at least not in a useful way, which means the next thing we need to talk about, or I need to remind you of, are some of the basic aspects of simple chemical kinetics.